So let's warp back to 1989. Castlevania the Adventure for the original Game Boy was basically a stripped-down version of a typical Castlevania game that you would play on the NES. While the lack of familiar enemies and sub-weapons didn't necessarily hurt the game, the sluggish control and overall sloppy game mechanics did. The end result was a game that is frustratingly difficult and considered to be more of a test of patience than an actual source of video entertainment. Fast forward to 2009. Konami had already released Gradius ReBirth and Contra ReBirth, brand new downloadable titles for Nintendo's WiiWare service that plays more like the classic entries in those franchises with smattering of fresh new paint. Naturally, a Castlevania ReBirth would follow, but rather than it being a new game, it is a theoretical remake of the original Game Boy non-classic Castlevania the Adventure. But make no mistake, while this is based on the original adventure in terms of story and setting, it is more of a return to the classic old-school style of Castlevania that made the series great before Symphony of the Night came along and ripped off Metroid. And it is a wonderful return to form. Although the story is pretty much the same as the original Game Boy title, it has been fleshed out a bit with an opening introduction that plays whenever you start a new game. As such, 100 years after Trevor Belmont first defeated Count Dracula, the Dark Lord once again returns to spread his evil. Thus, it's up to Christopher, the latest in the line of Belmonts, to uphold his sacred duty and defeat Dracula's evil forces. Again, it's not much, but it works, and for what's being offered, it's more than enough. Yeah, now this is more like it. How long has it been since we last had a brand new, non-remake, old-school Castlevania title where you would play through levels? That's a wonderful concept. And while this could be considered a remake of an old Game Boy title, the truth is that this has very little to do with that game, and concentrates more on bringing back the old-school gameplay that plays the same way it did on the NES, as well as implementing some new school tricks to the mix. While the game is a strictly linear affair, there are times where you come across alternate paths, either by acquiring a key or manipulating the environment in a certain way, so there is some exploration to be done here, and you have plenty of time to do so. It's a rather nice touch in combining aspects of the later, more recent Metroidvania-style games with the classic style that made the series popular to begin with. Christopher Belmont, once a plodding and sluggish character with about as much mobility as a slug, is now about as nimble as his forefather Trevor was. While he lacks some of the more advanced abilities such as multi-directional whipping or the ability to jump on and off stairs, he can control his jumps in mid-air and does have command of the traditional sub-weapons such as cross boomerangs, daggers, and holy water. In essence, he now controls more like the traditional Belmont hero of the old days, and that's a step up over his original form. Perhaps an important addition, or retention if you prefer, is Christopher's ability to shoot fireballs. Picking up an orb will allow your chain whip to shoot fireballs for a short period of time. It's a rather nice touch that adds some flavor to what is otherwise traditional Castlevania gameplay in the vein of the original NES titles. For the most part, pretty good. I'm happy, at least. Castlevania the Adventure ReBirth boasts 3 levels of difficulty: easy, normal, and hard. In general, the game's overall difficulty seems to be on par with, but somewhat less than, most classic Castlevania games. A couple generally easy first levels and punishing final levels before meeting up with Dracula himself, who will pose a challenge until you figure out his mannerisms. The levels themselves are rather long, and halfway through you'll fight a mid-boss, unless you take a path that overwrites that fight altogether. Seasoned Castlevania players may blow through this one rather quickly, but an average player shouldn't have too much trouble after a couple tries. Of course, once you beat the game, you'll unlock the classic player style, which essentially restricts your jumping and reduces the amount of sub-weapons you could use in the game. Makes for a good challenge indeed if you're into that sort of thing. Some people are divided on the graphical presentation of ReBirth. Either they like it because it looks like a really good old-school 16-bit title, only slightly more enhanced, or they hate it because it doesn't really push the graphical capabilities of the Wii far enough. Personally, I found ReBirth to be visually superb, but falling short of what could have been. By no means do I find the graphics to be terrible, on the contrary. ReBirth's whole visual style is almost comparable to Castlevania Bloodlines on the Sega Genesis to a certain extent, only a lot more colorful with some additional special effects that wouldn't normally be possible on the 16-bit system, and virtually no slowdown or clipping issues. The sprites seem to animate rather well, and even the bigger enemies move with such fluidity that it almost seems seamless, or something. However, ReBirth does seem a bit too colorful for my tastes, and that tends to kill the mood of the game, but on a whole, the style works and doesn't detract from the experience. And look, they even brought back the little map intermission scene that happens between levels, which is a rather nice addition thing, because you can't have Classicvania without that. At least I don't think so. I'm going on into this too much, aren't I? Anyways, let's move on. Outside of the title song, none of the original game's music is featured in ReBirth. Instead, we are treated to a soundtrack comprising a remix of lesser known but otherwise excellent tracks from other Castlevania titles. Some songs are great, others are not so much, but overall ReBirth's soundtrack is damn catchy synth music. It's too bad they couldn't fit in Battle of the Holy in there. It was actually a nice tune in the original Adventure. I know there's a remixed version of the same vein in the soundtrack, so I don't know why they didn't put that in there somewhere. Would have been a nice little touch. The sound effects are your usual share of sound effects, with some sounds having been recycled from older 8-bit and 16-bit Castlevania releases for that added bit of nostalgic flavor. It's a rather nice touch, but some of the more, shall we say, cartoonish sound effects could be done without. In general, game sounds awesome, at least for me. Castlevania the Adventure is the test of patience and quite possibly a test of durability for your video game hardware. Castlevania the Adventure ReBirth, on the other hand, is a wonderful return to form, not only serving as a solid return of the old-school gameplay mechanics that made the series popular in the early days, but also providing an adventure that is well-designed, polished, and most importantly, fun. While there's nothing new added to the mix, that's not really what the game's about. It's more about revisiting an old friend who's gotten a rather nice makeover over the years, and appreciating the finer points. Could it have been a better title? Sure it could. I personally would have been happy if they brought the multi-directional whipping from Super Castlevania 4 back and done some neat new things with that component. But as it is, it's actually a solid entry in the series that, if nothing else, heals the wounds set upon by the catastrophe that is the Adventure for Game Boy. If you like Castlevania and have yet to download this wonderful game, give it a shot.